Well, hello and welcome. Credential Engine is pleased to host today's important conversation on learning and employment records, or LERs. Our panelists will cover what's possible, what's equitable, and how to make LERs interoperable across data systems so that learners, workers, and communities can all benefit. We encourage you to share in chat your name, where you're joining from today, and to answer the question, what do equitable pathways mean to you and to the stakeholders you serve? We're excited to bring to you leading LER experts from Credential Engine, Jobs for the Future, and Digital Promise. Our panelists will introduce you to LERs, provide you with a market scan, discuss inclusive design principles, and how LERs can support more equitable learning pathways. We encourage you to record any questions you have for our panelists in the chat. We'll be answering those questions after presentations and during a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. And right now, I'm pleased to turn the spotlight over to today's first speaker, Everhart, Chief Strategy Officer at Credential Engine.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I am going to dive right into a definition of learning and employment records. So Devin, if you want to go to that slide, there we go. Now, you're probably familiar with digital credential technologies that have become really widespread, like open badges. So you may be wondering, well, like, what's different now? What's happening is that some technologies have evolved very rapidly, and they enable some critically important innovations that change the way people can use their digital credentials. So some of these innovations include that now an individual is able to have control over their own credentials, which enables new opportunities for agency. We can empower individuals to combine credentials from different sources, not only from different sources, but from different types of sources, so that they can combine education and employment and identity records all in the same wallet. There are opportunities now for instant verification of credentials without needing to contact the credential issuer. And linked open data provides a meaningful infrastructure for credentials that connects them to each other so that they can become pathways. And so now is the time for all of us to work together so that we ensure that these technology innovations are being used for good. So they're being applied to with inclusive design principles. So they're actually going to support agency and thereby enable equitable economic advancement for everyone. So in the next slide, you see just a diagram that shows like why this is so important now, because most of our systems and processes for creating and managing records of learning and work are siloed, they're disconnected, and they're inequitable. So across schools, colleges, jobs, military, on-the-job training, and lots of other sources, credentials are issued and stored in different ways. They use different data structures, different types of control, and rarely do people have control over their own records. Often these credentials can only be verified through complicated and expensive processes. Now, this is not just inconvenient, it's unfair and inequitable because it creates barriers to advancement. It can systematically exclude people who don't know how to navigate this or can't manage the costs of attaining these credentials. It can delay critical services and support and academic process, and it can impede economic advancement, both for individuals and for communities. So on the next slide, we put the learner in the center. We have technology opportunities now to break down those disconnected, antiquated systems and put people at the center. So we can empower people to understand and apply their own credentials to help them visualize and achieve their goals. Because at the center is a person who needs these connections throughout these cycles of continuous and cumulative learning. Because we all need to be able to discover like which credentials are valuable and meaningful. How do we enroll in relevant education and training programs? How will those programs help us achieve the skills that are documented in these learning and employment records so that we can share them with a common data structure that'll provide matches between skills and jobs so that we can get a job, get a better job, and continuously learn and advance. On the next slide, you see a graphic that's really about Credential Engine and our mission. Because in order to have these continuous and cumulative learning experiences, we need to transparently communicate what a person knows and can do. So at Credential Engine, our mission is to map that credential and skills landscape with clear, transparent information that empowers people to find the pathways that are best for them. So if we use these new technologies to issue LER packages, but we don't transparently explain what's inside those credential packages, we could actually make matters worse, because we could risk increasing the current confusions around different types of credentials. So with Credential Engine, there are lots of different organizations, colleges, companies, government agencies, and others that are sharing detailed information about credentials and skills, describing knowledge and skills in coherent ways in clear and consistent terms using the Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL. And together, we're building a linked open data network that everyone can access for timely and trusted information about credentials and skills. Because on the next slide, to just kind of boil this down, this credential and skill transparency is an important part of LER solutions, because when this information is communicated and recorded using CTDL, it provides an infrastructure that's open, linked, trusted, accessible, useful, and relevant. And on the next slide, we see that that's important not just because of individual credentials, but even more importantly, because of the way it can illuminate pathways, so that people can acquire and collect records of their achievements across many different environments in learning and work, and have those be connected with linked shared data. This data helps people understand their own credentials. Then they can articulate their own skills, and they can explore those important connections. So let me show you on the next slide something that makes it more concrete. There are lots of different verifiable credential and wallet providers, and this is a real example from the Velocity Network Foundation. So LER ecosystems have basically three types of participants. There's the credential issuers, the credential holders, that's the individuals who earn the credentials, and the verifiers. They're sometimes called relying parties because they're the organizations that rely on the data that's inside the LERs. So issuers, these are lots of different types of organizations. Education, training, employer, military, community organizations can all be issuers, and they all need to use open standards so that the LERs are all verifiable credentials that include CTDL data inside. And then the credential holders, the individuals, they can claim, collect, stack, organize those different records in a verifiable credential wallet that they control. So the credential holders need to be able to look inside their own credentials at any time and understand what they mean. So then the individual can curate these sets of these records to share on the web and in applications for education and employment and other opportunities. And so then the verifiers are the ones who can inspect these credentials and use them to make decisions and make opportunities available for education, employment, advancement, et cetera. And on the next slide, continuing with that Velocity example, you see how this actually works in a Velocity credential. Because in order to enable transparency and meaning, the LERs link to CTDL data that's been published to the credential registry. So apps like this and web interfaces and other tools connect the CTDL to opportunities for job searching, career coaching, pathway exploration, lots of other ways of using this data. And so a person can explore and understand these links in their own records, and that lets anyone find or define their own individualized pathways. So with these open standards, people aren't boxed in into any data that's in any specific system. And on the next page, you see kind of the spectrum of CTDL. It empowers people with these connections because it's literally a graph of links based on World Wide Web Consortium standards for linked open data. So the credentials link to skills, to jobs, to pathways, and because they're all described using the same terms so that people and systems can understand them, then these are meaningful networks in the context of LERs. In the next slide, you see a graphic that's, how this linked open data really explodes out in all different directions, because it's the power of that linked open data in CTDL that can provide interoperability for LERs from multiple providers, but also enables connections to other dynamic data on the web. So on the next slide, to achieve these key characteristics, I've just laid out the key global open standards that we all need to be using in order for this all to work together. The World Wide Web Consortium is the open standards body of the web, and W3C Verifiable Credentials, or VC, is the open standard for verifiable credentials and wallets. So think of this as like the universal envelope that lets us put multiple types of credentials through the same verification processes. That can be education and training credentials, employment records, identity credentials, as well as other things. And so once they're all in that same type of envelope, they're delivered, they're issued to individuals who can securely collect and store these different types of credentials all in the same VC wallet. So VCs can include any type of content. So it's important to have open badges to provide packaging that identifies the types of achievements in the records. And then those types of achievements need structured linked open data in CTDL so that they're meaningful to people and to systems. For example, to transparently describe the skills and the jobs that are related to the credential. So on the next slide, I've laid out just a few concrete things that you can do to make these connections yourself wherever you are in your role in the ecosystem. So figure out what information makes your LERs valuable and map that as data to CTDL so that that CTDL can be included in LERs that are issued to people. Make sure that issuing and receiving is done with VC credentials and VC wallets, and help people provide the systems of support that can help people actually understand how to collect and use their own LERs. So now I'm going to hand it over to Meena.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Deb. And so, hey, everyone, my name is Meena. I'm joining you on behalf of Jobs for the Future, and some work that we've done in the world of what makes an LER something that actually, in a wallet, something that actually fits into everything that Deb laid out, right? We're talking about this world of open standards. We're talking about this world of openly linked data. But if the technology that actually moves that data isn't open, and interoperable, meaning that it can actually move this information, none of it matters. And so a little bit about Jobs for the Future, as we jump to the next slide, is what we're really here to talk about and why we've landed a stake in the ground when it relates to this work is we want a world in which society offers equitable economic pathways. What does that look like and how does that work? And what are the systems of change that need to happen for that to occur in a meaningful way? And so that's where JFF starts to come into this work. So who are we really here for? We can build technology. This is like the number one thing that's out there. Technology is built all the time. And it's, sometimes we drop it into the world and it does stuff and other times it doesn't. And so when we look at different examples of people, and if any of you don't already follow Census Americans, I would encourage you to, from the perspective of understanding who are the people that we are actually trying to create mobility for. And so on the next slide, what you'll see is a couple of samples. And this gets us into why we're doing this work. And so on this Census Americans, the first one that I'm looking at is I work in foundries. I was laid off from work. I was born abroad to American parents. I was born in Europe. I'm looking for work. This is on the next slide. And this is a worker, for example, that we would be wanting to support. And if the technology we're putting out there and this whole vision of being able to move credentials for people to have incremental learning opportunities tracked and put together, for the overall network of openly linked data that Deb talked about, how does that help this person? How does that help the next person who has a GED, who works in landscaping, if you go on to the next slide, but isn't actually able to move anywhere else because of the way that their daily life kind of puts them into a certain pattern that limits their ability to engage in upward mobility to find family sustaining wages. On the next slide, what you'll see is someone who worked, wasn't able to finish college, and is still trying to figure out what to do next, right? And so when we think about this kind of talent, we start to get at that question of why wallets. And if you go on to the next slide, what you'll see is that there are over 30 million people who don't have the traditional college degree. They've been to college. There was a recent study that came out from Strata of the number one finding was that the number of people who thought they had an associate's degree but actually didn't is just phenomenally, it's appalling in the regard that there are a number of people out there who think they have an achievement they can share and don't. And this kind of lack of transparency is where wallets start to provide a way forward if they're built well. We have a labor shortage that we often talk about, but then there are all of these hidden workers, like we saw in those Census American slides, who have capacity, who have capabilities, and who would do well given the opportunity to be made visible. And given the fact that we rely on automated hiring systems, particularly at the point of intake, how do we then take advantage of what technology allows us to do now? 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had to rely on paper resumes. Machine learning was still coming out. Machine readability was still coming out. The easiest mechanism to look for were things like bachelor's degrees, high school degrees, college degrees. That's all shifted. And if we don't actually start to reposition the technology to center the worker again and consider what that shifting is, we're missing an opportunity. That's where wallets start to come in. And so if you jump ahead to the next slide, what we're really talking about is creating an opportunity for the worker themselves, just as Deb said, centering that person to actually take all of these incremental learning experiences, collect them in a series of wallets, a wallet that I might have from high school, a wallet that I might have from college, but because it's all in my control, I can start to make those connections across these otherwise siloed opportunities that are out there. And then to be able to pull a thing from each wallet and curate something that we call a presentation to show that employer or to put into that search system. But in order for any of that to happen, there are certain principles that we have to do. So if you jump to the next slide, what we're really leaning towards in the ideal vision is this movement of skills-based practices. It's where these incremental opportunities become very important. And Deb already laid out that VC model. What we're talking about is carrying that verifiable credential, that VC model into wallets, because we want to maintain an openly interoperable system. And at the level of technology, if we're talking about equity, if we're talking about ubiquitous access, we need to make sure our technology can talk to each other. That even when we're building all of these networks and these systems and these tools, that if they can't communicate with each other, we've created and actually amplified barriers that already exist. And so what are places that we want to look for? Where are these areas for impact that we should be considering? So if you jump to the next slide, what you'll see is that we're talking about the ability to collect those verifiable credentials, meaning a wallet or a series of wallets where I can collect those, that they can be incremental, that it doesn't need to be only at the level of milestone achievements like a high school diploma or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a certification, but that it can occur at smaller incremental pieces, that I as an individual have control. Part of this is a concept called self-sovereign identity, which is that who I am is who I'm supposed to be in my technology. That isn't something that can be messed with, and that I then have full agency to determine what I want to disclose, right? And we think about privacy laws, we think about all of this, it's all there. How do we bring those best practices into the way that I actually market myself as an individual and seek out opportunities for my own upward mobility? And then the trick is to do this at a level where it's not just for the upper echelon of workers who already know how to work in this technology. Then we've got the privacy piece. And a lot of this is also about the agency of what I can share and the privacy of who gets my information and when I can rescind that, how I control that. And then universal accessibility. This is part of the equity conversation of can everyone access it, but this is also the very specific conversation of, is the tool something that is actually technically accessible? Is it something that meets civil rights standards? Is it something that actually is possible for everyone to engage in? And as Deb said, right, in a way that I understand what I'm looking at, I know what I can do with it, and that regardless of my abilities in terms of being perhaps visually impaired, hearing impaired, whatever it may be, or a combination thereof, that I can still put that out into the world and show someone who I am and what I am capable of, not what I'm qualified for, but what I am capable of. And a technology that comes together around all of these 4 principles starts to allow that story. So if you go on to the next slide, what I would like to kind of share with you is what does it look like in practice if we put all 4 of those opportunities together? We are now providing a means to track, for example, lifelong learning. And when you're looking at the technology and whether it supports at that fundamentally foundational level a network that promotes movement, that promotes interoperability, that promotes all of those things at the level of lifelong learning, is it something that's based on an open standard? Because if it's not going to allow for the collection of work over the course of time in a way that all systems understand. Can it store a variety of verifiable credentials? Because if it can't, then it's going to block out all of the different types of achievements. And if you recall Deb's web slide, right, there were a number of opportunities that were there. If it only takes one of those, we're creating a barrier. We're creating a limitation. Will the wallet allow the worker and learner to receive those credentials and to share them back out? Right? Can it go both ways? And can they access that even if the organization is gone? So for example, I mean, let's look at what happened with ITT Tech a few years ago. All of those students lost their records. That never should have happened. It never should have been a situation that that learner and that earner and that worker never owned their achievements. So when we're talking about lifelong learning and you're looking at the technology and you're thinking about equity, does it do these things? On the next slide, we start to look at individual agency, right? So this is now me as a user. Do I get to decide if I want to use different wallets? Do I get to move my achievements? Let's say that my high school gave me a wallet and then I did job workforce-based training and they gave me a wallet. Can I pick my own wallet and move my credentials into it and still maintain the other 2, right? Is it based on an open standard that allows me to create custom profiles? And this is that idea of what I was saying before, those presentations. Can I put together versions of myself through all of my achievements, through my own story to show someone what I can do for them if they gave me an opportunity? And can I choose how and where I store that data? So over time, we're really talking about taking the ownership of that achievement sort of away from the person that issued it. And we're saying when I issue it, it's now in your hands. And when it's in your hands, you get to decide what you're going to do with it. Super important when we're talking about equity and mobility. On the next slide, we start to look at what privacy looks like. Do I get to decide how much of my information is out there? And can I change that? If I want to revoke something, can I do that? Is it easy for me to keep track of that information? Because one of the double-edged sword of giving someone full access to all of their data is then they should have full access to control that data. Privacy is really important. Does the wallet support that? And where do we start to see those lines kind of fray? And on the last slide of areas that we can consider and question when we're talking about accessibility, are they using universal design for learning? This is a great way to see if they are centering that access piece. Is this actually available to our most hidden workers who are in places that may not have broadband access to internet, that may not have the technology that is at the highest caliber? Again, that upper echelon of our workers and learners who already have access to opportunities. If we're further helping them and we're not helping those individuals who are the hidden workers, we're missing the opportunity completely and we're further exacerbating the divide. And is it easily usable? What does that user interface look like? Do they understand? And exactly what Deb said, right? Can I clearly understand what I've earned, what I've achieved, what I can do with that, and why it matters? So you put all those things together, and what happened with this JFF market scan is we went, and there was a whole team of workers, largely championed by Sharon Liu, and started to look at what are the different solutions that are out there. And if you jump to the next slide, what you'll see is that these are just some examples. I would encourage you, if you haven't looked at the report and you are thinking about how to engage in the technology piece, for equity and access to take a look at JFF's wallet scan, and you'll see these solutions, you'll see their strengths, you'll see the areas that they're going to be continuing to grow to be able to hit those 4 opportunities we talked about and to be able to effectively answer the questions that we've presented. The other thing I'll leave you with is what are some trends to watch? And so on the next slide, what you'll see is that there are a number of movements that are coming forward to try to create that ecosystem of interoperability. It's a big ask to make sure a lot of technology can talk to each other. It is not just a local effort, it's not a national effort, it's a global effort. What does it look like for all of these tools to be able to in some way translate and work across one another? And so the first example that's up here, the Wallets as Foundation of Services, that is a global standardization movement. The next one that's on here is formalization of standards. This one is policy related, but it's not just, like I said, local, regional, it is also national and global. You've got the interoperability for technology through open standards. We're thinking about how does this work and how do we learn from other places in the world that have started to figure this out. And then networks. And when we're talking about networks for learning and employment mobility, the Velocity Foundation is a great example of the types of networks we're talking about and figuring out how to engage in skills-based hiring within ecosystems and then making sure those ecosystems can talk to one another. And so ultimately what we're now left with is where are we headed from here? What is the work ahead? And if you jump to the next slide, it's really what we're talking about is interoperability at scale for everyone. If this technology isn't interoperable, if we're not able to answer those questions, if we're not able to think about those opportunities for impact, there's nothing that we can do. And so the question that I'll leave you all with is why then is, if you jump to the next slide, the technical specification of a wallet important when centering equity and social mobility? That is what we're trying to present to you here. I would encourage you to continue to think about that, think about your populations and the regions and workforce systems you serve, and consider what leaps to the top of that priority list. And with that, I would like to thank you. And I think if you jump 2 slides ahead, we can turn it over to our peers at Digital Promise who have some great work to share with you. Dr. Brian Tinsley and Dr. Kelly Page, welcome, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Meena. As she said, my name is Dr. Brian Tinsley. I'm Senior Research and Communications Associate on the Adult Learning Team at Digital Promise, and I'm joined here by Kelly Page, who's the Director of the Learning and Employment Innovations team here at Digital Promise as well. For those of you all who may not be familiar, Digital Promise is a 501(c) national nonprofit that was created during the Obama administration, and we have the mission to spur innovation in education. So we work at the intersections of education leaders, of researchers, entrepreneurs, and technology developers to improve learning and opportunities to learn. If you go to the next slide there. And so I'm just here to talk a little bit about the research that we conducted in the past months and we've published. Kelly will drop a link there for you all so that you can access it as well. I'm gonna run through these slides a bit quickly because some of you all out there who have been to these presentations may have already heard me speak before, and that's all right. But this research is focused on the development of inclusive design principles. We heard a lot of folks talking about the importance of equity and the importance of voice and consideration of users so that we do not exacerbate the issue, but mitigate the issue of users being able to access technology and being able to access opportunity that they may not otherwise have if we don't take certain things into consideration. So we wanted to take this opportunity to raise awareness, to center the user experience, and to be able to ensure that worker learner voice is heard and thought about, because those are individuals who design technology oftentimes isn't necessarily representative of all of the users that will be using that technology, right? So we need to take into consideration lived experience. And so the outcome of this work was to develop those design principles as well as to develop user profiles, and then to increase awareness of the potential value and the potential use of LERs. So if you go to the next slide. Just a little bit about who we included in this research, right? So we maintained a couple of cohorts, 4 cohorts of individuals. There was 27 predominantly women of color, age 18 through 65. And as you see there, approximately 44% of them worked full-time, as well as 44% maintained 2 or more jobs. But if you juxtapose that to 48% of them earning less than $40,000, right? And so then if you look to the bottom, you see that 26% were not comfortable using Zoom. So we're talking about the design of technology and the use of technology. And it's important to take into the consideration that this medium that we're using here today to present to you all that we now see as commonplace, right? 26% of them were uncomfortable using this technology. So just to jump ahead to the principles, as a function of this work, as I said, we had multiple cohorts and we were able to glean a lot of information, a lot of the stories that these folks had to share. Talked about their successes, their challenges that they had in applying to jobs and using technology in order to do that. And so if you skip to the next slide, you'll see that first design principle there is to demonstrate evidence of skills and competence in addition to work history. So LERs should be able to provide opportunity for users to communicate skills and to communicate their competencies that they've acquired via these various jobs and experiences over time. As well, LERs should be able to enable people to verify and certify skills that they've developed. And also, LERs should allow for credentials to be issued, and endorsed by third parties. The second principle is that LERs should demonstrate learning progress over time, not just one point in time, such as a degree completion, right? We're all familiar with, but we understand that not everyone is able to necessarily complete a degree for a variety of reasons, right? And so individuals should be encouraged to, the space should be made for them in the design of LERs for them to indicate if they have acquired certain skills or certain knowledge, even though they may not have completed that particular journey. So LERs should be designed to allow for the demonstration of learning in progress, as well as LERs should include a feature to present an individual's interest and aspirations in a career pathway. So the third design principle is that LERs should provide individuals with control of how their information is presented and shared. And you heard Meena touch on that. Meena's been reading our report. And so LERs should offer the end user the option to remove and or choose who has access to demographic information, personally identifiable information, or PII, and to be able to determine if something is potentially harmful, such as indicating a date, right? If a person is of a particular age, if they're a seasoned individual, they've been seasoned in the field, they may not necessarily want individuals to know, want a company to know what date they may have finished a particular credential, because they may feel that it might bias the hiring manager because they feel that that person may not fit the company culture in a particular way. And so biases and discrimination was something that came out of these design sessions that we had with our, as we call them, our participant advisors. But if we go on to principle 4, another issue was that we feel that LER should address safety and privacy concerns, especially of historically and systematically marginalized individuals. So LER should be explicitly clear about who has access, again, to their information, but LER should also clearly communicate and the potential benefits and the potential limitations of using technology. And as well, LER should connect individuals to free, accessible, and readily available technical information. Essentially, there should be in-demand access to helpful information, helpful platforms, whether it comes in the form of an individual organization's platform, or if it's on social media, that perhaps videos and information so that they can readily click on something and be able to understand how it is that I should navigate this piece of technology that I'm trying to use. So the fifth principle is that LER should prioritize a lifelong access and ease of use. Something else that Meena also touched on. The LERs should be accessible. They should be jargon-free. They should be easy to use, right? In addition, LERs should allow individuals to access and to maintain their own LERs, regardless of the institution. Should someone graduate from a particular institution or transfer from a particular institution, they should still have access to that information. All right. If you go to the next slide there. So those are the 5 principles. And as I said, we also developed use cases. And if you go to the link that Kelly was able to drop, you can read more about them. But we want to leave you with this, that the working people must be included, must be involved, their voices must be centered when we're doing this work. And that's something that Digital Promise always tries to do. And so just as including people in the design of LERs is important, it's also critically important that we listen and we learn from learners about their pathways and how LERs may support them during these pathways. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Page.
Brian, thank you. Meena, everyone, thank you for sort of sharing. And I think that brings us to a point, we've shared a lot about the technology, a lot about, how we define, describe, discuss the data architecture that is learning and employment records and the digital wallets, which make them accessible to end users. But if we go to the next slide, what we're going to talk about over the next couple of slides is how might these technologies, including non-traditional credentials such as micro-credentials or badging, really serve to support more equitable learning pathways. Now, the work that I'm going to share is a combination of 2 projects that we currently have ongoing. So I'm hoping we're going to get an invitation back when we've finished the work to be able to share a little bit more data and information as to what we're learning in the field. But if we go to the next slide, really when we think about pathways, and we're at Digital Promise, the 2 projects we're really focused on is regional pathways. How might we co-design them? How might we consider them? How do learners and earners in particular, how do they visualize, verbalize, feel about the notion of pathways? And we're also doing a project that's looking at learning transitions throughout someone's pathways. So to give you a sense of what pathways really mean to us, pathways are a collection of learning events that an individual travels through, journeys on, traverses. And those learning events can occur at work, at school, at home. They could be life events, family events. What's interesting around this approach to pathways is it very much is grounded in the learner and the earner, the individual. What is their lived experience of a pathway? And pathways are critically important. We all are traveling along many different pathways. And often we talk about pathways when we're referring to students or employees or colleagues or people we might want to onboard. Yet pathways is something that touches all of us, yet it touches us all. We experience them differently. In terms of what we mean by equitable pathways, this is where we're really looking at how learners and earners, they don't just have access to career opportunities or access to learning opportunities, they actually have agency in the co-design of their pathway as they see them. And so that's a really critical part of how we see equitable pathways. So when you think about pathways, before I go forward, I ask you to really reflect on yours. What was your learning experience through school, into workplace? How many pathways do you potentially experience at the same time? We have multiple different roles. We might have multiple different pathways to our skill and learning development. So really what we're focused on at Digital Promise is really developing and exploring our understanding of how learners and earners, especially those historically and systematically excluded, people of color, Black, Indigenous, LGBTQIA, and poorly resourced people, how they verbalize, visualize, and really describe their pathways. Because for an LER to be supportive for them on their journey, it needs to be presented in a way that really supports what is the lived experience that they're going through. So we go to the next slide. In our learning around this, we often also focus with pathways, work is focused on a specific pathway program. So it might be, what does an IT or tech pathway look and feel like? What are the supports one might need along that pathway? When in fact, learning is continuous and cumulative. We are doing it 24/7. Even when we're sleeping, we're learning and our skills are developing. So in our approach of looking at pathways, in addition to seeing them as something that occurs in multiple different contexts, it's also something that's constantly ongoing. The only thing though around this approach to learning and thinking about pathways through this learning lens is that often when we think about pathways, we're focused on the learning that occurs in a workplace, in a learning program. And so we're not necessarily considering all the other learning contexts when skills can actually be developed. So along your learning journey, you may transition multiple times, you might change jobs, you might move geographically, you might go from high school into employment or from employment into college. Those transitions are really important along the learning journey. So in the work that we're doing at Digital Promise, we're listening and really developing an understanding with learners and earners as to how they describe their transitions. And also, how do they describe the challenges along their pathways? What are those challenges? What supports do they feel that they needed? And their language around talking about their skills throughout their learning journey. To give you an example of one learner that we have been working with, they shared about how as a teen, they were a carer for an elderly family member at home. And so as a teenager, they developed certain caring skills that could be transferable into a healthcare workforce or job or role. Yet they had no way to make visible those skills in any traditional credentialized way. So trying to see a different approach to how we see learning is really important to starting to think about the myriad of context in which we could see learning and employment records, or especially micro-credentials, could serve to make visible those different kind of experiences. If we go to the next slide, oh, and the other thing is, are they transferable? So on a learning journey as well, we often switch, we change, there's a number of terminologies we talk about in terms of learning experiences. One is off-roading. For example, you go off-road from the expected learning path. So you might be expected to do a certain, any kind of workforce training, and you might decide to do something else. Or say, for example, you start a nursing training, and then you decide you don't like nursing, so you're going to teaching. And so there are transitions that happen, and whether you're off-roading or leapfrogging along that learning journey, it's really important for us to get an understanding of the language around those skills and seeing if they are still transferable and how they might be transferable. One learner we were working with was actually a former nurse who later in life was transitioning into teaching. Unfortunately, traditional credentials don't really assist in making visible what were those transferable skills that came from, say, for example, patient and nurse relations versus to teacher and student relations. So it's interesting how micro-credentials could serve there. So the next slide, what we're learning is pathways are varied, multiple, and diverse. People are traversing multiple pathways at the same time. They're very different, they're very diverse, and also learners and earners, there's no two visual maps that are the same. And it's really interesting to sort of see what are the moments of magic, the moments of celebration, the challenges, and where supports and certain non-traditional credentials could serve to make visible someone's learning along those pathways. So we go to the next slide. Well, another thing that that's coming up in our work is around learning and skill development, unfortunately, is not equitably recognized. So it's very biased as to what it recognized. The current system, both employment and learning institutions, they don't really recognize how individuals truly travel and learn over time through multiple different contexts, and also how they can demonstrate their skills in different contexts. So using a competency-based model such as micro-credentials can actually assist us in making certain skills developed, demonstrated over time, to give learners, especially Black, Latina, Indigenous, people who have perhaps very different skill-based development, opportunities to have their skills verified, validated, and they can make them visible. So having access to powerful learning and skill development, we know that it's not equitable. And this is one way by which understanding the true lived experience, how can we make it equitable? So if we go to the next slide, this is just a visualization of how our current system, sadly, really recognizes traditional credentials, traditional contexts in which these credentials are actually earned, where it privileges certain learners and earners over others. So the work we're doing at Digital Promise is to really look at, we know pathways are not linear, we know they're diverse, but what are they? And how could you make them visible? And then how could an LER actually support learners along those pathways, however they choose and whatever body or institution or workplace context they might be learning those skills in. So for us, it's very important that we really pick apart and have an understanding of the different ways of living, actually learning and career pathways. We also have been very intentional about what might be the supports, the type of credentials that could actually mitigate these inequities along those journeys. The data we're collecting comes from learners and earners to really share with us those different experiences. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a slide to sort of share about the key question that we're asking in every community we're going into. So we're doing a regional pathways program, which is in a number of different regions through Texas at the moment, to really explore how might learners and earners, especially those historically and systematically excluded, can actually equitably demonstrate what they're learning, where they're learning it, what are those skill-based elements of evidence required, and how can they explore and have agencies over the possibilities of a pathway for themselves. And this is where we see the important marrying of understanding the lived experience of pathways and then looking at the actual design of an LER or digital wallets and how they could be most functional, effective, as well as providing the necessary information for people along their pathways. So if we go to the next slide, we're using an inclusive innovation approach where by going into different communities, we are asking the question on how might we design more equitable pathways, especially using two technologies. The first is micro-credentials to help make visible, whether it be in a K-12 environment for youth, skills they might be developing outside school, in home or family life environments, or even in-school training programs, internships or on-job training, and how micro-credentials could be used to support them in their career development and their interests. And also how micro-credentials at a regional level might be embedded within a higher education program and be stackable towards a degree. So for example, RGV in Rio Grande Valley in Texas, we're exploring the future of healthcare and really looking at healthcare pathways and how as young as 14 to 18 in those youth years, what might be certain essential skills as well as specific career-related skills youth are developing in K-12 that then also could be stackable towards if they pursue post-secondary program or development. We're also involving employers, regional employers in our co-design workshops and our discussions, because what's really, really important is that the micro-credentials are not just verified and validated by an educational agency, but they're also recognized by employers in a certain industry to be demonstrating certain skills and therefore can be used towards promotion or could be used towards any type of licensing within that industry. So this is the work we're doing at a regional level to really understand that lived experience of pathways, how micro-credentials can support it, and where LERs fit, if we move to the next slide, is we fundamentally believe that if LERs are designed for inclusion and learning transitions, as Brian shared with you, the key design principles our adult learning team developed with learners and earners, then they do have the potential to keep track. Learners can keep track of their learning, they can verify and transfer their skills. They can also attain a variety of different types of credentials. And I think that's really, really important because there are a myriad of different kinds of credentials. Sometimes we just talk degree, diploma, micro-credentials, where there are hundreds of different types of credentials that individuals can actually obtain over time. access education and training, and also more easily apply for jobs. In a number of LERs that we've been looking at, they've matched the digital wallet to a marketplace. So there is the possibility and the opportunity to be able to share your credentials in an application type format or a resume to actually apply for different jobs. If designed for inclusion, that's our biggest caveat. We really think LERs have that potential to really support individuals and their families. So if we go to the next slide, what we envision moving into the future is where a world where learners and earners can really pursue countless pathways to life-sustaining careers. And as we're finding in our research, individuals regard the role of a father or a mother as a pathway where you're developing skills, and skills that actually could have impact in the workplace. Whether you're in nursing, whether you're in teaching, there's a number of different skills and pathways that we're actually pursuing. Demonstrated skills are recognized and rewarded, not just by educational institutions, local workforce development agencies, but also in the workforce by employers. Higher education institutions actually partnering in a system by which the micro-credentials are then stacked also towards degrees, whether they be bachelor, associate bachelor, or so forth. Learners have agency over their learning data. I think this is really key, and it's one of the design principles that we have, is that we're moving towards a world where learner and earner data is theirs, it's personhood. It's not an asset for an organization to be sold. And I think this is the biggest cultural change that we're seeing employers and institutions in particular going to need to grapple with, is that learners actually have control of their data and information and can share it with whom they want to give consent. And so we're moving into what we call the ownership economy, away from an information economy where data and information is an asset. And lastly, employers recognize these verified skills for recruitment and promotion. So to help us and vendors as well as individuals vet LERs, if we go to the next slide, what our team has done, our marketplace team has taken the 5 inclusive design principles the adult learning team developed, and we've turned them into product certifications. These are product certifications for LER digital wallet vendors, where they can be evaluated along those different 5 criteria as to whether their technology meets the criteria, and then receive a badge so that it's an indicator of the quality of inclusiveness that their product has. Here are some examples of some other badges, product certifications our team does. We believe very much in evaluating the quality of the technology on these different principles for design and development. If we go to the next slide, just to give you an overview of our product certifications, this has been in development for the last 5-6 months, and will be released in end of July, start of August. And LER technology vendors can apply for this certification, go through our process along the different criteria that mirrors very much the inclusive design principles. So we go to the next one, whether that be skills and credentials, information ownership, safety and privacy. You are evaluated by an independent assessor, and you then will receive an indication of your level of achieving this certification. There is a link there at the bottom if you want to have a look at our product certification platform, specifically for the evaluation of LERs. So we go to the next slide. Okay, for those that might not be technology vendors, if you are an educational institution, an employer, someone who is interested in, okay, how do we vet an LER vendor or partner? We've written this article, it is in Getting Smart, and it has a series of questions that comes from our work on the learning design principles, as well as the emerging work we have on learning transitions, to really what are the questions to ask or to consider when vetting LER vendors along these inclusive design principles. And I think Brian has just posted the link for you to that article so that you can really look at it from if you are more of a third party than a technology developer. So the next slide, just to sort of finish off, the other way we're ensuring the equitable design. So in addition to really looking at pathways and learning about pathways from learners and earners, the lived experience. We've got 5 LER projects in total. The first you've heard about from Brian here today, the adult learning team on the inclusive design principles, which our marketplace team turned into design certifications for the product. We are currently kicking off another project just on learning transitions, which I briefly told you about how LERs can truly support learners through processes of change or at times of change. That will also become a certification. The Learning Transition Project goes from July till December. Our design certification goes from January through to April next year. And we also have our adult learning team kicking off a large project on end user onboarding, education and supports for LERs to learn about them. And it's a professional learning community. So that sort of gives you an overview of where we're really grounded in the learner and earner, their lived experience of using these technologies, and also of pursuing life-sustaining learning and career pathways. So I think that is it from Digital Promise. And I think I'll hand it back over to Deb.
Yeah, so I'm gonna make one point and then ask one question. Let me ask the question before I make my points. You have a moment to think about it. What would you say is one of the most important things we can do, probably need to do together, to empower people to take advantage of these new technologies? And while you give that a moment of thought, there's been some back and forth in the chat about the money and who pays for all this. Let me just be emphatic that it is not the individual learners who should be paying for this. And in fact, almost all of the models that we're seeing, that's not the case. So for example, employers are very eager for these technologies and will pay for this in their technology systems because they want to improve the talent pool in terms of how they can hire both externally and promote internally. So I'll leave the money issue at that and turn it over to Meena and Brian and Kelly to answer the question about empowering learners.
I'm happy to take my first go at it from the perspective of where JFF is currently doing work too. I think that the most important thing that we can come together and do is engage in this sort of behavioral shift and change and how we think about what matters, and then make sure the technology allows that what matters to move forward. And in this instance, it's valuing the attested credentials and items that come through in a format that we trust, technically trust, right? That it can't be changed. So adopting this open standard, ensuring the technologies we're using adopt the verifiable credential standard in this conversation, in this context, that the credentials that are moving are in that context as well. And that we then move our systems, and this I think is a we thing. It's our hiring processes, it's our hiring intake systems, the ADPs, the Greenhouse, the LinkedIn's, and all of them to actually ingest this machine readable data such that the people who are consuming it, the employers, the people who are doing the hiring, and that are helping workers and learners move around our systems, have to pay attention to it. Because if they don't have to pay attention to it and the technology doesn't allow it to occur, all of the work that I firmly believe that Brian and Kelly have brought up today can't be realized. So that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, I would say, and if you were at the JFF Horizons conference in New Orleans, you heard me reiterate this multiple times, but I think that a primary way that we need to empower folks is to provide them with a sense of agency when developing this technology. As you said, Deb, organizations are excited about this because it gives them the opportunity to be able to essentially like filter through applicants and to determine what applicant is best for them to bring them into their agency, bring them into their culture. But we need to ensure that there is interoperability, as Meena has touched on so much, with platforms, with websites that provide information about organizations so that individuals are able to look through these pieces of organizational material, all this information that is out there in some form, but not readily accessible to them necessarily. We need to ensure that they have access to this information so that they can determine for themselves what type of organization they want to go into, what type of organization they want to dedicate their lives to, regardless of whether it's a year or a decade, ensuring that there's interoperability with websites such as Glassdoor, websites such as Inside Voices and others that convey information about the culture of these organizations, the credentials of these organizations. I think that's important.
Yeah, and just to pick up off on Brian's point, the notion of actually co-designing with versus designing for, it's really important that we start to recognize how we're working with our colleagues, with students, with learners and earners in the design, not just of the technologies themselves, but the data flow and the data access and the data ownership. LERs, in my opinion, will only truly be successful if organizations let go of control of the very thing that makes them function, and that is the data that is embedded within our credentials and information. And so that's, to me, to empower. It's all about designing with, and actually, most often than not, listening to learners and earners.
Thank you so much to all of you for listening to us today. We'll be providing information after, including the recording of this presentation. Thank you.